Good morning. I'd like to welcome members of the Population Health Roundtable and all of our guests who are watching online today. I want to remind our viewers that you can send questions by entering them below the webcast window or by tweeting using hashtag #PopHealthRT. Please start the tweet, if you will, with the cue for a question for the panel, and if you would also tweet the word question in quotation marks as another option. This is our final open session for the series, Population Health in Challenging Times, Insights and Key Domains. I'm Phyllis Meadows, Senior Fellow with the Kresge Foundation, and I'm delighted to serve as the moderator for today's session. For the next hour and a half, you will have the opportunity to spend time in discussion with key representatives from the philanthropic sector and to learn more about the impacts of COVID and the racial justice movement on their leadership, organizations, and their organizations' investments. The bio sketches for each of the foundation panelists are detailed on the web page, but I've asked each of our guest panelists to provide a very brief introduction, just stating their name, title, and organization. And we'll start with Rose Green, since she's first on my screen.
Hello, everyone. My name is Rose Green, and I'm a program officer at the Colorado Health Foundation. Thanks for joining.
Marion?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Marion Standish, and I am Senior Vice President at the California Endowment.
Jacqueline?
Good morning, Phyllis. Jacqueline Martinez Garcel, CEO of the Latino Community Foundation in California.
Michelle?
Good morning, I'm Michelle Larkin. I'm Associate Executive Vice President at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation based in Princeton, New Jersey. Good morning.
And William.
Good morning, everyone. William Buster. I'm the Executive Vice President for Community Investments with the St. David's Foundation in Austin, Texas.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. So I wanted to spend a little time just sort of framing the conversation today. I don't think I need to do a lot of that because you've had that over the last several days. But I think we all are very aware of the events that we're facing today and how they're asking us, or more appropriately demanding, the philanthropic sector, us personally and professionally, to begin to modify our actions while simultaneously taking a reflective pause to examine more fully the deep intersectionality of racism, health, economics, and the historical and structural elements of power and social justice. And to think about all of these, or not, in the midst of a global pandemic. Watching and being part of the philanthropic sector for the last 6 to 8 months has been an interesting case study for me in adaptive leadership. In Michigan, for example, the philanthropic sector, along with government and the private sector and local businesses, worked collectively to unify its support in response to the immediate needs related to COVID-19. The philanthropic sector became extremely more flexible and malleable in response to the supply chain needs, PPE, equipment, testing sites. And they listened in a way that I've never seen before to the sectors on the front line of defense, including those in the public health settings, social services, education, and of course, the health systems. I saw the sector truly listen and respond to the needs of people. Grant making became easier, quicker, and more flexible. We at the Kresge Foundation quickly moved to refocus our investments, prioritize differently, and we suspended rules and relaxed reporting requirements. And we worked hard to ensure that our grantees were able to sustain during these turbulent times. I had one philanthropic colleague in the state who said, we're finally doing real grant making, taking on the big issues, but addressing the issues from the ground up. It has been quick and easy, and we are now, along with our grantees, challenging a number of assumptions, practices, policies we hold about what matters in our work. The sector in many instances mobilized and recalibrated approaches for rapid response to COVID, an issue with deadly consequences that surfaced less than a year ago. The issue of racial injustice, on the other hand, has existed for decades, actually centuries, also with deadly consequences. And we're in a period of social reckoning. And the question remains, how do we address the immediate as well as the long-standing that are inextricably linked? There are a lot of thoughts, predictions, and conflicting accounts about where we are with COVID and where we're heading. We are also up against a poorly reconciled history and presence of racial injustice, which will undoubtedly demand transformation in philanthropic practice, policy, and investments. Saying that we are in uncertain times, confounded by concerns about the future of our democracy, economic uncertainty, some of the big picture items, along with growing joblessness, food and housing insecurity, and other challenges regarding the sustainability of the sectors who have been the safety net for the public throughout history. Uncertain times may be in an inappropriate descriptor of what we're seeing. We're in turbulent times, unsettling times. There's a restlessness and there's chaos. So with that said, I'd like to start with our panelists on a personal level and ask you to just share your thoughts on this question. What is helping you to stay grounded during these turbulent times? And what among the many issues facing us today are at top of mind for you personally as you contemplate your role in philanthropy? So whoever wants to start, and I'm a professor, so I can call on you.
Phyllis, I'll go ahead and start, in part because I was really moved by your opening remarks. It was just so well articulated and organized, because to your point, it feels like such a chaotic moment, and it's hard to even organize our thoughts these days because there's so much happening at such a quick pace. What I can look to in terms of grounding right now is that because there's so much disruption, because there's so much the world as we know it being turned upside down, that there is a glimmer of hope in breaking down the things that have led us to this moment. The systems, the policies have needed to be disrupted. And whether that meant people flooding to the streets, angry, to get people's attention, then so be it. I know those are maybe controversial words to use, but we've had centuries of this racism embedded in our systems and our policies, and it's enough. And when I think about what's front of mind right now, it is the confluence of what racism and our democracy have meant. I'm concerned for our democracy in the sense that racial injustice causes trauma and causes a sense of hopelessness. And we can't afford that at this moment, because our youth have taught us we have to remain hopeful about what can happen in the future. But as things continue to shift, not necessarily in the best directions, I worry, like, how long can people hold on to that glimmer of hope that things can get better? And how will that affect our democracy? Will people remain civically engaged? Will they get out the vote? Will they stay connected to their county leaders and show up to city hall meetings demanding change? Because we know that those meetings and people fighting for those things is what really leads to sustainable public health changes, housing changes, educational changes. We can't rely on the leaders. We have to rely on the people to continue to voice what they need and demand it. So just thank you for helping me organize what's been going through my head. because to your point, it's not uncertain, it's turbulent times, and it's sometimes hard to keep your head focused these days.
Yeah, Phyllis, I think one of the things for me, when we go into these kinds of times, I think it's easy for us to kind of look everywhere and get really discouraged by the immense pressure that people are feeling. But for me, I think what it's done for me this moment is make me look in and slow down and to breathe. And as a Black man in America, I think one of the best things that I've seen happen is a reconnection with family. There is a group of men in my family that we haven't been talking in years, and now we are talking every single day, and they are regular guys. They are truck drivers, dock workers, factory workers, teachers, and we're talking about issues that I've never heard these men talk about before, and we're talking about it in a way that connects us. And I think that's happening all over the country, is that people are having the opportunity to reassess and ground themselves. And I'm hopeful that what I'm seeing is that I'm seeing, and I'm hearing about it in other families, that families are reconnecting. And I think that when you think about what really is worth saving and what's really is worth fighting for, is the saving of community, families, communities, neighborhoods. I tend to kind of think of things in those terms. And though things are happening at a national level that may seem and are chaotic, I think when you look outside your door, that is the first place where you should be focusing. And I think families and communities are having the opportunity to do that. And I'm hopeful that because of the things I'm hearing from across the country, that people are engaged, that narrative is not the one that's being put out there, but it is happening in local communities, that these folks that have never been engaged before are now engaged. And so I'm hopeful for what happens over the next several months for our country. So family is connecting me, and not everybody can do this, but my kids. I've now spent 7 months with my daughter and son that I probably never would have had in my lifetime. And though they are absolutely driving me crazy, I know that in 10 years, I'll look back on this and say, this was the most delightful time of my life.
Awesome. Thank you.
And Phyllis, I couldn't agree more with the comments from Jacqueline and from William. I mean, I do think that, as you point out, it's turbulent times. For me, what's keeping me grounded is family. Spending time with a teenager. I don't think I ever thought I would hear myself say that I'm happy to have a teenager, but I am. She's been incredibly resilient in how she's handled this situation and how her group of friends have. And it made for me even more real the complexities that families have who have younger children, and how our systems have been designed in a way that don't allow people with small children and don't allow people with jobs that don't pay a living wage and don't have a lot of the benefits that we all are privileged on this call to have, how they struggle. And so it's been really grounding for me to think about how I can show up in my community in a way to provide both support and bring a voice. As a single mom and as somebody from the LGBTQ community, those issues that we struggle with collectively as a nation around the various isms that have built into our systems need to be addressed, and this is a time. So that is grounding for me. It's brought a whole new sense of community, how we think about increasing community power as my little community that I live in does, but it's also been pushing us to think about how we be more intentional about the narrative that gets put out there, and how we tell the stories of people and what they're actually struggling with as we deal with very unknown times, right? We don't know what the virus is going to hold for us in the next couple of months, what it's going to hold for our economy, but these are not challenges that have just shown up with COVID-19. These are challenges that have existed for our country for decades and decades and decades. And I think now what brings me hope is there is that fervor from people in communities who have been suffering and under the weight of these oppressive systems, and how we in philanthropy can do a better job of stepping up and bringing our voice and elevating those narratives. It's not our job always to be the voice, but it is our job to amplify the voices and to make sure that we're holding people up and doing what we can to both support and increase community power that already exists. And how do we do that in a meaningful way? For us, it's also about how we think about data and what comes through and how we do that. And all of those things, as I think about my role in the philanthropic sector and my organization's role in helping to really change these systems that have created real inequities for people across the country. And what does that look like? How do we show up differently? How do we show up with people? And what does that role look like for us? So it's the teenager has grounded me in many, many ways, as I said at the beginning.
I'll go next, Phyllis. Thank you so much for those introductory remarks and everything that folks have said about what's grounding us. I couldn't agree more. I think ironically, work is really grounding me. And I often think to myself, oh, well, what would I be doing if I wasn't, working right now? I would be somewhat challenged, I think, to explore and examine as deeply as I've been doing and our organization has been doing our role in this extraordinary moment that we're in. In some ways, I'm, and this seems a little odd, but I'm excited by the moment that we're in. I was, before I became a lawyer and before I got into philanthropy, I was planning to be a history professor. And I think thinking of the historical context offers a lot, for us as we make our way through this moment. And both the fear, and I want to, call that out because it's a very scary time, but also the opportunity for change is just momentous. And for all the reasons Michelle and Jacqueline and William already mentioned, I think it's a moment, and it may be a long moment, by the way. It may not be a short one, but our communities have been in struggle for a long time. And what is particularly profound right now is their visibility, that we are not just us in the philanthropic community, and that not that just those in the progressive community, but nationally and globally are being seen and heard. And they're being seen and heard on issues and challenges that Black communities, communities of color, Indigenous communities have been living for all these years. And I think, Michelle pointed that out. And finally being seen and heard is so important. And you can't put the genie back in the bottle, right? So this is not going away. How we face this moment, this time as individuals in philanthropy, our children, our grandchildren will be reading about, in the future. And the opportunity for change is extraordinary. And I really hope we may not win it all, but I hope we can make some really good progress in winning some of it. So thanks for giving me the opportunity to participate in this panel discussion.
I would echo much of what has been said already. And Phyllis, thank you for setting up the conversation the way you did. I also feel that family is incredibly grounding. I have a 17-month-old daughter who is at home with me, which is the best and the hardest part of the pandemic so far. And she doesn't know what's going on. And thinking about our ability to mold the future and to bring a future into reality for her that is so much better than what it could have been, I think grounds me and makes me feel optimistic and hopeful. I think also nature and thinking about the earth and just how small we are in such a big universe is really grounding. And because it is such a scary moment, I try to return to the idea that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. It's a quote that's used a lot, but it's incredibly meaningful to me. And I think that in many ways, in this country, so many of us have become comfortable or complacent or apathetic about a system that we are all a part of that is an inequitable system. It is built on inequity, and that is how it works. And so I am thankful for being able to work against that and to have the opportunity to work in philanthropy and try and move things in a different direction in what is essentially a revolutionary moment. And so that helps me return to where I should be and what I should be doing.
Thank you, Rose, and thank you all. It's interesting as I listen to the conversation, this sense of grounding, even whether it's with family or children, brings you closer to the voices of people and brings you closer to the people element. And I was just curious, because I do believe that there may be opportunities in the face of what we're seeing and how much more we're connected. Let's just talk a little bit about, your work. You had to respond to COVID, and I'm sure there's the concerns around, building a better society and addressing these longstanding injustices. How has your foundation begun to pivot in the midst of these challenges? And are there opportunities to build on any of the things that we've heard, like the issues around families, and how do we take the positive and build on that? Or just curious as to your thinking around that.
Phyllis, I'll take a stab at it. One of the things that we asked ourselves was, what do we really do with the reports that we get? What do we do with the information that we require these organizations to give us quarterly or biannually or annually? And we had to be honest. We don't use it in ways in which people think or that we should use it. And so we said, we need to stop asking that question, because people are working. They are having to do work that they didn't have to do the day before or the weeks before. And so that was one of the key things that we immediately said, don't send us any information, focus on what you're doing. And then the second thing was, and use the resources that we've given you in ways that your community needs you to use them right now. And what that has led for us ultimately is we are asking differently. Long term, how will we ask questions about how people are doing their work? I think it allowed us to get a little bit more personal about, okay, so tell us, what are you doing? What are you up to? What do you feel good about? What don't you feel good about? In more of a partnering kind of way. And so I think we're going to do that moving forward. And the other thing that it allowed us, we didn't have a history as an organization of doing general support. And we just have decided, and we're working with our board to say that is best practice. I think we can do this in a way that allows us to partner with organizations that are in line with our mission, and allow and support them to kind of do things that their community calls them to do in ways in which they need to do it without being confined in this box that says RFP or anything like that. And so I think we're going to move those things forward. And I think the last thing, and I'll share it, that's really been critical for us is we're asking questions in a different way. We're listening, more importantly, in a different way. And my hope is, moving forward, is that part about listening and truly being responsive to what our partners are saying will be baked into how we do our work moving forward.
Awesome.
Oh,
go ahead. Uh-huh.
I think to that point about general operating support, that this moment gave us evidence that we can do things in a different way and it works. That we can not have as many reports or do general operating support. Our foundation gave away tens of millions of dollars related to the pandemic or throughout the year, that most of which was donations that didn't require even applications or a report. And we can look back and say, oh, that was successful. The community would use that money in the right way, and we were able to make a lot of the change or provide a lot of the support that we wanted to. And so I think the question now is, what do we maintain? How do we move forward and not lose any lessons from this experience? I think for us, this moment was an evolution and an amplification of the change we had already been making. We were moving towards equity. We were moving towards deeper community engagement. And this really pushed us on those issues, pushed us to progress and to really connect deeply with people. But it didn't feel as much as a pivot as it did about us just sort of going deeper in the direction we already were, and really recognizing that equity is not a trend in philanthropy, or it shouldn't be. It's something that needs to become a part of everything we do going forward.
I would say, Phyllis, for us at the California Endowment, there are a number of things that have happened. I'll just focus on a couple of them for right now. We have been focused on building power across community-based organizations, organizing groups in California for a good many years, and it is the direction that we're going in. And I think we felt really affirmed in our strategic direction that power building is the right direction to go in, and that we are going to be building on that base over the next 10 years. But just to your specific point, I think one of the big changes is speed. I think we came to realize that so many of the deliberations that we do on the internal side, and we offered flexibility to our grantees doing more general operating, et cetera. But the need for speed in getting resources to those impacted communities was quite front and center for us. And I think we proved to ourselves that we could move much more quickly and make decisions and get dollars out quicker than we had ever done before. I'd say in the first month of the pandemic, we were able to spend about $5 million, new dollars, make 21 grants in 72 hours. And that was a pretty remarkable, I think, as all of you may imagine, feat. But it was something we proved to ourselves we could do it. And we began to move our systems to move much more rapidly than they have ever moved before.
Awesome, Marion. Jackie?
Yeah, so for us at the foundation, we're a community foundation. So much of our work is centered on racial equity, and Marion used power building. Our mission is to unleash the civic and economic power of Latinos in California. So much of our work is grounded in that. During this period, we've just had to be much more attentive to those power builders and those movement builders. It wasn't so much about how are they organizing and deploying, it was how can we support them and their families to make it through. And so while we were deploying those resources to them to then send out to families, or food, transportation, the emergency things that were happening with the wildfires, people losing jobs, the Latinos impacted with COVID. But we also just made sure we paused for them, for the ones who were doing the work on the front lines. The latest retreat that we had was to also provide mental health support and counseling to them, creating those spaces so that these program directors, EDs, program associates from these organizations that are constantly hustling to support and lift up our communities had the undergird and support that they needed to keep pushing forward. The conversation that we were just having about grounding was grounding for me. And I realized also what a privilege it is to be in philanthropy, that to Marion's point, we get a chance to think about these problems and talk about them. But there are families that are right now, including the nonprofits that we support, that are still trying to figure out how they're going to put food on their table, or what happens if another family member loses their jobs. And, you know, it's a privilege that we have, that we get to enjoy a little bit of time with a 17-month-old child, because there are folks who are needing to still walk out the door and get that second job done so they can pay their bills. And so making sure that that network of nonprofit leaders, the folks who are just constantly on the ground, had the support that they needed was priority number one, and realizing how important it is for us to continue to fixate on that as we move forward.
Thank you, Jacqueline.
So from our perspective, you know, we, like Marion, provided about $50 million in humanitarian aid to help some of the families and communities feeling the greatest strain under the COVID health emergency. As Jacqueline said, people were really wrestling with how to get their immediate needs met, who have been and continue to suffer from the long-term policy failures that we've put into place as a nation. And so we put out that $50 million to really focus on food, housing, and income assistance for things like rent support. And we prioritize the communities that have suffered the greatest inequities, including communities of color, lower income workers, indigenous communities, and people with disabilities, to make sure that we were working with the nonprofit organizations who know and are connected to people on the ground so that those resources could get into people's hands as quickly as possible. I can't underscore enough the comments that have been made around speed. You know, we are a national philanthropy, and so we work through other nonprofits many times to really get that connection to the work that is happening on the grounds, to understand what communities need and how we can be most helpful to them. One of the ways that we did that is really shrinking the amount of burden in terms of reporting. Getting rid of a lot of it, as William pointed out, is one of the ways that we didn't want to take that time, because these nonprofits that we help support are actually providing real on-the-ground emergency services and supports to families and communities across the nation. And so taking any kind of burden off of them was a priority for us. The other thing that we did is we moved to make more general operating support grants, so that the organizations that are aligned with our mission and our strategies, that they can do the good work that they're doing, and they don't have to worry about writing a lengthy proposal and going through all of those parts and spending the time to do that. Lastly, I would say one of the other things that I think we have really elevated throughout the pandemic, and had started to elevate prior to that over the last several years, is really about the connection between health and equity. And in particular, as we see how COVID is ravaging Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, that we are really stepping up our game in terms of being a national voice and speaking up directly to the public about racial equity in particular, and how this is not a political issue. This should not be a partisan issue. This should be, how do we as a country rally and move forward to make sure that communities and people, no matter what job they do, where they live, how much money they make, have every opportunity to have a fair and just access and opportunity to health and well-being. And so using our voice in that way is something that we've really, I think, ramped up over the last several months and longer than that. And then lastly, I would say, to echo Rose's point, we have not pivoted our strategic grant making. What we've done is taken a look at how COVID is showing up, how racial inequities are showing up, the calls from community members about how we can be most supportive to them. And what that's done is really point out the system inequities and the systems that we have been working on as a philanthropy, but it is calling into question in terms of not what we work on, but how we do that work, and how can we be more supportive and intentional about increasing community power, making sure communities have good data that is disaggregated to make the important decisions that they make, making sure that we are both listening to and engaging with racially diverse groups, and making sure that we're hearing from the communities that we're trying to serve about what they actually need and how we can best support them in that. So I would say it's not a pivot, it's that tweaking and that refinement to make sure that we're having the greatest impact that we can have to address racial inequities and promote health and well-being for everyone.
So you ready for the hard questions? Because I always think it's easier, as foundations, we focus on, what we do out there. And the harder part is what we do in facing, sometimes. And so I just kind of wanted to ask, because I see this as an expansive moment. It's an opportunity where we've seen what we can do. We can change, we can refocus, we can pivot, we can move quickly or more quickly. We can, put ourselves closer to the ear of community so that we're moving in sync with what the needs are. So how do we, as philanthropy, this is your conversation with the field, how do you keep that expanded moment from contracting back to the old mainstream ways of doing things that have, in a way, perpetuated a lot of the challenges we see out there? And that affects who we fund, how we fund. So just, how do we make sure that stretch doesn't contract and we go back to doing business as usual? Who wants to start?
I don't know if I want to start, but you're being very polite, Phyllis.
Oh, okay.
I think you're being very polite.
Harder.
But now that I have the thing on my face, I'll try and answer that question. And I've spent 8 years in a private conversion foundation in New York, and came to the Latino Community Foundation because wanted to see things being done differently and had an opportunity to build from the ground up here. We can't, I'm going to say the obvious, right? We can't afford to go back. And I'm speaking as a Dominican woman, daughter of a Black Dominican father, white Dominican mother, who grew up in Washington Heights, who understands that, philanthropy, like so much of our private sector, has been the cause for so much of what we're still witnessing right now with economic injustice, racial injustice, you name it. The first gut answer that came to mind when you asked the question is, fight like hell for things not to go back. And it starts with accountability. It starts with accountability with, boards, with CEOs. And I was on a recent call with another I'm just going to call them out, grant makers in health, about a conversation about the next training of leaders in philanthropy. And honestly, in that there were 3 of us, and we said if people can't understand how racism has played a devastating role in how we think about philanthropy, then if people can't be convinced of that, then they're part of the problem. And calling that out is just what we need to do. I think it's enough with the niceness and the politeness, and get over yourself and see that if you cannot see that we can't speed up, trust the people that we fund, get the money out, get rid of all the reporting, because we trust the people on the ground to do the work. If we cannot keep it that way, then we need to look in and say we're part of the problem. And I don't have a nice way of saying that, and other than holding up that mirror and holding up the folks that are sitting in those positions of power to say it's time for you to move on. And I know that it's easier said than done in places where there's agency, but to CEOs who complain about boards, you can do it. There's a way of figuring out, of moving board members in who get it. Because there's plenty of people out there who've been woken during this season and who want to use their talent, their treasures, and their power to actually do something good. And we need to get those people in the places where we need them so that we can keep moving forward. So that's how I would answer your question.
Thank you, Jacqueline.
Phyllis, I think one of the things that we should do, well, first, I'll just take this screen, for instance. This screen that I'm looking at is very diverse, gender, racially, ethnically, and yet that is not what our field looks like. And, so you want us to be honest and sincere. Let's be honest and sincere. We have to get tactical and operational about this. We have to change what the field visibly looks like. And for each of us who have agency within our organizations, if we have the power to hire, we have the power to kind of do contracts and all those kinds of things. We have to put those things into practice and then measure it and then ask ourselves, look back every year and say, how did we do? And if we didn't do good, how did we change? And so we have the power to change what we look like, and each of us within our organizations can do it. I hope we could do it collectively and ask each other and talk to each other. But, philanthropy only works well together on panels. But if we can take this into the real world, we should then hold each other accountable for that.
I'll give it a go here, Phyllis, and building on Jacqueline and William's comments on two levels. First, internal and then external. The California Endowment has been on a very intentional advancing racial equity journey over the last, I would say, 2 years. And the journey that we've been on is comprehensive. It includes all staff and all board members, and it has been challenging and fruitful at the same time. I mean, it has forced us to really have a conversation using the language of white supremacy, which I think all of us understand has been very difficult language to use, and really asking ourselves, and at the board level, these very difficult questions. It forced us to really articulate the notion that for us to achieve health justice, and we are a health foundation, we have to tackle racial justice. In other words, there's no path around that. And I think part of our internal journey really pushed us to say that and say it out loud and begin to invest our resources in that direction. And we're looking at everything we do. Vendors, investing, grant making, staff. And I think I feel particularly privileged, not just working at the California Endowment, but in California, where diversity, we do live a lot of our diversity values. We haven't achieved it by a long stretch, but I think when we look at our organizations and we look at our grantees, I feel quite proud of what has been accomplished, and of course now what can be accomplished. But I want to say one other thing externally, and I hope we can continue this. I think, we mentioned this concept of speed, which I think is one, but I want to say something about spending. We need to spend more. We need to spend more on our partners. We need to spend so that they can operate in not just a general operating support context, but be flexible and responsive, be resilient in these times going forward. If we think this is really the moment, such a historical moment, we can't put them on a 2-year grant cycle with limited resources. How can we spend in a way that gives our partners the room, the maneuverability that they need to operate effectively? So I think that's a challenge and something we're certainly thinking about, but we need both internal and external transformation, I would say.
So, I think this is an incredibly important moment for all of us in philanthropy about how we show up in these conversations and push ourselves to be more candid and direct about where our shortcomings are. There is an opportunity for us to make those changes in a way that we have never had before, because we're looking at ourselves, our colleagues are looking at us, and we should be, quite frankly, pushing ourselves and pushing the changes in our organizations that we need to see, not just right now, but that we need to see over the long term. And many of the folks who spoke before me have already outlined some of those. For example, there are lots of calls for philanthropy to put out more than their 5% requirement from the internal revenue. For those who are listening, who aren't from the philanthropic sector, to hold our philanthropic tax status, we only put out 5%. We're only required to put out 5%. I'm happy to say that for our board, we had that conversation with them, and we are putting out significantly more than 5% this year. And that money and those resources are actually going towards promoting change on the ground around continuing to push to increase community power. And I very specifically don't say community power building. And I talk about it of increasing community power because communities already have power. What happens is that they don't always get heard. And so how can we as a national philanthropy show up to help increase the power that's already there? So doing that kind of work helps us not to change. I think the points that came up around how we hire, how we contract, how we are explicit about the connection between racism and health equity, and the inequities that communities of color have suffered and continue to suffer. I think being honest and honoring, as Jacqueline talked about, where philanthropic resources came from and how they came to be, and how we honor that history. And when I say honor, I don't mean honor, praise it. I mean honor in terms of acknowledging it, recognizing it, and then talking through with the communities that we are serving. How do we show up, and how do we use those resources for the betterment and the advancement of systems change and policy change, so that these systems that are continually creating barriers to the services and resources that people need, how do we actually undo that and make sure that we're dismantling those systems and creating systems that are actually responsive to the needs of people. So I think those are all points along the journey that we're in. And to do that, we do have to call into question our own biases, our organizational biases, the barriers that our organizations have put in place, and how we move from a compliance standpoint of you need to do your report and check the box that you did this, to an impact, and how are we serving and supporting community nonprofit organizations and regional and state organizations to do good work that they do, and to have the impact that they seek to have that aligns with our organization, our foundation missions and visions. Because I think there's real opportunity for us to do a better job of listening and understanding how we can work together to create the solutions that we hope to see in our nation, because we need to make some changes.
Rose?
Michelle, to your point about the 5% payout, I worry about the next couple of years there being a contraction, that foundations are good, we respond to the moment there's a crisis, and then it's like, oh, we've got to make up for that so that we can get back to our original number. And I think we need to be really smart about continuing to spend more, recognizing that this moment is a long moment. I don't remember which.
Totally agree.
That earlier. I think also in terms of accountability, especially if you have a private endowed foundation, there are very few formal sources of accountability. And so we have to hold each other accountable. We have to hold other foundations accountable, and we are very afraid to do that. And so we need to get out of our comfort zone and say what we see and talk about the issues that we see. I think about also moving beyond these sort of large public foundations like many of ours that have been on our equity journey to all of the philanthropic money that is in different kinds of foundations or donor advised funds where a lot of this work isn't happening. We need to figure out how to reach out to small family foundations. I spoke to a director of a family foundation who said, I print articles out and mail them to my board members so that they will actually read them. So thinking about how to support those folks in trying to figure out, for all of the money that's going out, how to do it differently, I think is really important. And then in terms of the piece, William, that you brought up around staff and hiring, I think there are lots of things we can do to hire more diverse staff. We need to move them into decision-making roles, and we need to provide support in our organization so that they stay. I'm part of Emerging Practitioners in Philanthropy, which is an organization, philanthropy serving organization for folks who are newer to philanthropy, and they do a report called Dissonance and Disconnects, and found that the majority of staff of color who have come into philanthropy and are, I think, within the first 5 years, plan on leaving because they don't feel supported. They don't feel welcome. They don't feel like they can do the work they want. And so we need to think about how to institutionalize these changes so that people can feel supported and move up and have influence as opposed to just being frontline staff.
Thank you, Rose. The questions from our viewers are starting to roll in, and I certainly encourage others to submit questions to the panel. So we may not have an opportunity for everyone to respond, but if you feel so compelled when you hear the question, please jump in. One of the questions is, as we look to increase the diversity of leaders in the field of philanthropy, how do we ensure that the field is primed to welcome new perspectives? How do we avoid new leaders feeling like they need to be indoctrinated into fitting in? So maybe a couple of folks want to respond to that.
Yeah, I'll build off what Rose was talking about just now. I think it aligns with what she was just saying. I think one of the things that I've done is I've been very intentional about inquiring people and engaging people about the culture from which they come from. I need for you to bring who you are into the office. Now that is antithetical to what people talk about, but it's a lie that people don't bring their selves to the office or to their work. And that's just not true. And so what you have to be intentional about is knowing and understanding that there's been a dominant culture in this country for a few centuries. And now we have to be intentional about how we challenge that. And you do that by engaging how people process culturally things that are around them. I'm very curious about how people's families interact and what that means to then how they do their work day in and day out. And so there's a way in which you can do it. I do it all the time, and we do it in our organization, and it then affects how we ask questions. It affects the decisions we make. It affects the ways in which we move about our communities. But it is a very intentional process that can get uncomfortable. Let me be clear about that, because it is challenging something. It is challenging a dominant culture, and things do not concede without struggle. And but being intentional about it is something that I think we can do and should do.
Okay. Would someone else like to add to that, or? Okay, let's go to the next question, which I think is a pretty quick one. Has each of your foundations eliminated caps on indirect support with their grantees as a means of providing operating support? And if so, will this continue past COVID?
So we have benefited from the work that other philanthropies have done around what they called the True Cost Project, which was looking at that very question of what do we need? And we actually increased our indirect rate for the majority of the nonprofits that we work with to 20% this year. And we are not going back. We were working on that, and then COVID happened. So it was a good moment for us to be able to make that decision and move forward with it. We are not going back, but we are going to keep looking at it because we're not sure that that's the right amount. May not be the right percentage, and it's something that we're going to continue to look at over time and talk to our grantees about to better understand what they need so that they have that flexibility and that reserve, and we're not unintentionally starving our nonprofit organizations so that they can't flex and do the important work that they are doing.
We have not formally changed our indirect policy. We are very interested in the true cost analysis and how we can better support our partners going forward, particularly in building that sustainability so that they can be in the fight for the long run. So it's very much on our list.
Okay, so let's take the next one. And I have to preface this by saying, Michelle, I really appreciate the way you were framing your power work, you and Jacqueline both. I do have somewhat of a visceral reaction to power building, assuming, that it's sort of, for me, it's sort of a dominant frame that we will give you something that you don't already have. And I know that's not the intention. I love the California Endowment, Marion. So I applaud. I know you're in your heart, but I do think sometimes the way those narratives are framed. So I'm going to read this question as it was written with that power building notion in it. And what the viewer said is that philanthropy did indeed respond quickly to the current crisis and didn't feel the same way about government in many respects. But felt like the way we responded, that this situation is not sustainable. And the question is, what are the longer term implications for the role and expectations of government in its power building in individual communities fast enough or powerful enough to make the changes we need as a nation?
I gotta jump in to that question, Phyllis.
All right.
And by the way, that's unleash the power, right? I think that's a little slightly different than build, because we know that the power is there. It's just creating those opportunities for people to just move together and move powerfully together. Is it enough? It is exactly what we need. The problem that has led us to this point is that we have not invested in unleashing the power of communities of color to define, to execute, to lead, to be in those places of power that we need them to be in, so that the values that we all say we care about are actually done and executed in policy, in systems, in organizations. It is not going to happen overnight, because we've had centuries of disinvestments in communities of color. And so when I was talking about the hope that our youth have right now, it is incredible to me that brown and Black youth still have hope at this moment. But I was one of them. Like, I grew up in Washington Heights, and I understood that there had to be a better way. That's what kept me moving forward. There had to be a better way. And if we don't invest in that right now with all we've got, no matter if we're working on health or education or housing, if we don't invest in that sense of agency and hope, then we can try and change policies at our rate and try and influence government. It ain't gonna work, because people need to own and speak up to the solutions that they wanna see happen. I wanna see some of these young people that are organizing movements actually sit in city council positions and actually run for Senate positions. I wanna see them be the ones to write the laws and sit in places where judges sit right now to define the case of police officers versus a Black woman who was murdered in her home, right? Like that's what we need to do. And I'm not looking for this to happen tomorrow. I'm looking for this to happen in this generation. And so we have to accelerate investments. And yes, it is enough. Yes, it's what we haven't done and what we need to do now in order to see this type of sustainable changes that we all want to see. And I'm just going to throw this in, because you asked a question of how within our organizations we can actually make some of the things that we're talking about right now outlive this moment. Write them into your bylaws, write them into your policies, like commit that your board is going to be racially reflective of the communities that you're serving, not necessarily the states that you're serving, but the communities that you're aiming to support. Write it in and commit that, 20% of your grant making is going to be to unleash the power of communities of color. Write it in. Make sure that the next person who steps in understands that this moment of pain that we're all going through wasn't in vain.
I don't know who wants to follow that.
I'll just add, build on Jacqueline's comments, because I love the unleash the power, and I think that is the right language. But in order to unleash the power, we have to do two things. We have to absolutely be fast in our grant making. We should be spending more. We have to sustain these commitments. to community-based organizations, to organizing groups. We have to connect them in a larger ecosystem to, I think Michelle's point about people who can generate data, the lawyers who have been so much the backbone of a lot of the movement over the last number of years and really helped us mitigate the harm and reverse some of the harm that we've experienced. How do we really get more intentional about sustaining those grassroots organizations and the ecosystem that keeps the movement moving forward? And then we have to strengthen this whole field of unleashing, what we'll call unleashing the power, with long-term leadership commitments, building that pipeline, building those places, those opportunities where organizers, advocates, policy change makers can connect and strategize and plan. We really have to see this as the long arc that we're talking about, and that we don't, as a progressive field, and I'll say that, really have an infrastructure that can really move itself forward. It is by and large fragmented, and part of our work ought to be to connect all those pieces.
That is exactly right. We need to think of this not as a project, as a grant, as a program, as an organization, or even as an individual leader. We have to think of this as a movement. We have to fund it as a movement, which is long-term, which is 10 years, 20 years, 50 years. And we have to fund advocacy. Many foundations are afraid of funding advocacy work. We have to fund grassroots organizing, and we cannot just fund grassroots organizing. We have to fund it at the level that we have for a very long time funded large, institutionalized, often under the dome advocacy organizations. We have to flip it on its head.
Thank you, Rose. Michelle, did you have something you want to offer?
And I think one of the things that we haven't talked a lot about here, but we also have to focus on the evidence side as well. And that has to be done fundamentally differently than how philanthropy has thought about evaluation in the past and determining whether or not something works, but really doing it in a much more equitable fashion where we're designing those evaluations together, because that is not only how we as philanthropy can help support those nonprofit organizations and something that we can offer, but it's also a way that as government is changing, which will be an incremental process because that's how it's designed, that we can be helping those nonprofit organizations make the case with good evaluation, which is good data that shows that the work around unleashing the power, increasing community power is actually fundamentally important to supporting civic engagement, supporting those positive changes that we all want to see in our communities. And how do we do that? So being very thoughtful about how we collect, how we analyze, how we support both data collection and evaluation and research is something that philanthropic organization, the philanthropic sector can be supportive of into helping to shift those paradigms around what it looks like to move us more towards equitable evaluation that both serves us as a sector so that we can learn and grow, but more importantly, serves and is of value to the organizations that we're working with so that they can continue to grow and get the support and the resources that they need to continue to do the work that they're doing.
So I have one other question, another question from the viewers, and I'm going to take a little creative license with it. But they're asking, are any of your foundations thinking about your investments and applying the values that you spoke of thus far, so there's consistency between the values that you aspire and the investments that you're making? Are you doing anything in that space currently?
Phyllis, I want to better understand the question. Could you repeat that again? I want to make sure I'm hearing it correctly.
Yeah, I'll read it as it said. It says, how are your foundations thinking about your investments and applying your values So there's consistency, and I'm interpreting that as, you have these values and you have investments. How are you making sure that they line up?
I can quickly speak to that. So the Latino Community Foundation before COVID existed to invest in Latino-led organizations. So when we define that, we say more than 51% of your board and your staff is Latino. And we also invest 65% of our investments are in organizations that have budgets of less than $1 million, which means that these are many of the organizations that we fund are grassroots, haven't had the luxury of having grant writers and others to join them to, get them over that $1 million threshold that often helps organizations grow deeper. So we really focus on those dimensions, but more importantly, the investments that we make are in trusted community leaders that represent the lived experiences of the people that they are supporting. And so when we fund in the Central Valley, the organizations that we fund are oftentimes the daughters and sons of farm workers who now leading an organization that are working with the daughters and sons of farm workers to give them experience in the digital sector. And so making sure that the money does follow the values that we talk so much about.
Okay.
I hope interpreted the question correctly, Phyllis, because I was
I think so. Michelle?
So I interpreted the question a little bit differently, and I thought what the person was asking about is sort of how do we invest our endowments or our private resources to continue to fund the work that we support. It's a question that we're constantly looking at and challenging ourselves on to do better. In particular, as we've had issues and investment sector has had issues over time of investing in ways that are detrimental to communities of color. We call that out. We have that conversation because we really want our investment strategy, and I think we're in a good place with it, our investment strategy to support the strategies that we're taking programmatically across the organization about how we think about investing in housing and ensuring that everybody has safe, affordable housing. What does that look like in terms of our investment strategy and looking at those types of things. And so it is a constant conversation for us as we continue to evolve our strategies to make sure that that alignment exists between our financial investments and our programmatic investments. And I have to say our CFO, our Chief Investment Officer, and our program leadership has been really very intentional, in particular as we've come along on our journey around equity, health equity and racial equity. What does that look like, and how do we show up not just on the programmatic side, but across the entire organization?
I interpreted the question in the same way as you did, Michelle. And to that end, we have some of our endowment in program-related investments, which are mission-based low-income loans. We have looked at our endowment through the lens of ESG or environmental, social, and governance questions to try and make sure that we are investing in the areas that align with our values. And finally, we have looked at the managers of our investments and thought about how we can move more of our investments to managers that are women and people of color. And the fact of the matter is, in any given year, the vast majority of our money is in an endowment and not in grants. And we have right now the money, the power, and the decision making. And so we really have to think about how to make that change in the long term in order for communities to have agency over resources and decision making.
And Rose, those tactics and those approaches that you talked about, from PRIs to female minority-led investment funds, people of color-led investment funds, like those are things that we've been working on, as well as doing some of the leadership development work in that field, because it's a hard area to break into if you're not of the dominant culture within that sector. So we've been doing some of that work. Yeah, it's been good.
I would just add, and I interpreted the question the same way that Rose and Michelle did, but Phyllis, you know this field better than anyone, particularly in the PRI territory, and how many of us are really pushing the agenda on shifting how capital works in the system and looking for creative mechanisms, to shift resources and to bring resources into communities of color and disinvested communities overall. It's certainly a challenging journey, but it's one I think most of our organizations are very committed to. Our investment portfolio, we are always looking at diversifying our investment managers. Our board is always examining how we are investing our resources so that we are consistent with our values. I think we, can always do better, and I think we will do better. And we need grants in the field, along with investments, to help facilitate some of that movement. And I'm not sure we always do that as well, but that is really a part of how we move the field of investment and capital towards a more equitable outcome.
William, did you want to add anything to that? Okay. You good? Okay. I had another question for you. Based on just some conversations I've had recently where a few people were talking about that they see foundations as extractive capitalists, learning more from communities than we actually do. And to what degree, if at all, do you agree with that premise? And what are you doing or need to do to enhance your accountability, which we've been talking about all morning, for sound, equitable investments? So are we extractive capitalists, learning more than doing? And, do you agree with that? And if so, if not, what are you doing to make sure that you're enhancing your accountability to the people?
That's a really interesting term. Whoever wrote that is a pretty smart person. I don't really know what that means, but let me take a stab at it. I think that we are, we don't do enough by way of putting not only our money resources into it, but our thought resources, our connections. And I think one of the ways in which I've done my work is doing just that. You have to be intentional about if you're going to support a community. Let's say it's a rural, low-income community, and they're trying to improve the quality of life of all the folks in their community. All the connections that you have should be poured into that community. If you know that you have connections at the USDA, if you know that you have connections with rural economic development practitioners, you have to bring those resources into that community, not just the grants, but all of the relationships that you have. And so instead of being extractive about learning, let's learn how these rural communities struggle, and let's learn about that. You be intentional about what you put there. And I think that if you take that approach, as I've learned, communities are deeply appreciative when you do more than just give them a grant, when you truly partner with them and say, all that I have, all that I know, all the people that I know can be yours. I think people are very appreciative of that.
I think Michelle said something really worth just reflecting on knowing our history as a sector. To be extractive of a community is also thinking that we're not part of that community. So if we're going to really deeply understand that we are a part of the community, but understand the history of the sector and how we became a sector, I think it will help us understand how we continue to still be extractive of community. We don't pay taxes. We sit on assets. When I answered the question of investments, we don't even have an endowment as a community foundation. That's why I interpreted the question differently. But there are foundations that have endowments of over billions of dollars, and sitting on those assets and paying 5% is just unjust to begin with, because that money could have been integrated into the public sector, for example. There's so many different ways that we can cut into how that money could have been put to use. And so I think we have to be honest with ourselves and see how we are extracting ideas, knowledge, human capital. I mean, we set out to do these priority areas and these objectives, and we think there are ideas. Meanwhile, the community's been saying, "Hey, we want to do this," and we don't invest in those community-driven solutions as much as we need to. And I have to say that all too often we take too much credit for the work that the community is actually driving and doing. I'm a huge fan of the California Endowment because they did finally change the narrative of community happens, in zip codes. I'm sorry, that health disparities happen in zip codes, that where I live matters, that my how long I live actually depends on where I live, right? So they really shifted that narrative. So much of that work came from the community organizers telling the foundation, it's the zip code. And so, I think it's making sure that we elevate, and the endowment has done this, and I think can do more of it. I'm friends with Mary, so I can tell her that, but making sure that we elevate the fact that these solutions, the narrative is coming from community, not philanthropy, from community. That when we invest in large firms to, drive a communications or just a communication strategy, that we acknowledge that the ideas that they're extracting are coming from community, that these consultants that we pay to come up with the solutions that we need or the logic models are coming from their interviews with community organizers. And so are we investing the same large amount grants, right? To let those organizations do what they're telling those consultants to tell us to do. So yeah, I do think that we still are being extractive. Yeah.
I'll just jump in real quickly, Phyllis. It is a really challenging term. I agree with William. I hadn't heard it before, so I'm sitting on that a little bit. But the California Endowment.
Gotta thank millennials for that.
Yeah, over the last 10 years has really learned what it means to be, proximate to community, really close to community. And, it's not a measuring stick, but the idea here, and Jacqueline is talking about it, is how do we, in philanthropy, where we have goals and strategies, and we write up long papers about all of this and how we're going to support it or not, really listen and adapt. I mean, I think there is nothing wrong with us having ideas and putting them on the table at the same time that community is putting their ideas on the table. But how do we really work in partnership? How do we listen? And how do we change? And change shouldn't come in, like 10-year increments. It should come in much closer increments to what we're hearing from community, who is living the experiences that we're talking about. Our essential workers, in a pandemic, they are living that experience, and we need to listen to that experience so that our resources can be legitimate in terms of addressing those experiences. We have, and I'll just give this one example, a President's Youth Council that is quite a dynamic group of young people that meet now, not just with the president of the foundation and share what their experiences are, what their ideas are, what their aspirations are, but now has a formal relationship with our board of directors. And they are meeting, in a relational way, with our board to really understand, for them to understand how the board makes decisions, but also for the board to understand what, the young people that we're working with are thinking about, dreaming about, wanting to see what their expectations of the foundation might be. And it is we have to listen and we have to be able to adapt. And philanthropy does not have a great history of that. And I think that's where extractive really hits home. And I think we have to be able to adapt to changing circumstances, to the voices of people who are most proximate to the experiences we're trying to address.
I want to underscore. Go ahead, William. Sorry.
I just really just wanted to say to Marion, I think you're understating Bob's youth council. I know those, I've been in that room. Those are some young folks that probably most folks would be afraid to be in the room with. That's a real opportunity. I think more people should actually look at what you all are doing and learn from that. So I commend you all for that because I've experienced it firsthand, and I love what's happening out there.
Yeah, I wanted to pull through the pieces around how you actually work with and create with versus being extractive, because I do think philanthropy has a long history of reaching into community and not giving back or not showing up in a way that elevates the solutions that are coming from community. And that's part of the journey that we're on as a sector, and that as a national philanthropy, it is more challenging for us to get proximate. I know with Cal Endowment, you had your set of communities that you invest in. For us, we've taken the approach of really trying to listen to communities across the country and understand what works with them, and doing much more work around creating learning networks that people can tap into. William, I loved how you were talking about, like, I'm going to show up and you're not going to just know me. You're going to know the people that I work with. You're going to know the evidence that I see. You're going to have access to those research pieces. You're going to have access to the communications, and how we do that in a way that doesn't feel overwhelming to a community or feel like you're dropping in and saying like, oh, here's everything that I know and you should do, because that's not real. Like, they're the ones who know, and we are trying to walk with them so that we understand what they need and think about how we can garner the learning that we're doing from across the country in a way, and those solutions from across the country that make those direct connections between community to community of, hey, this is not in your state. You might not have bumped into them, but we're funding somebody on the other side of the country, and they have some really similar context that they're sharing with you. And here's your numbers, here's your emails, here's how you can connect to learn from each other and help push the solutions forward. So that's some of the ways that I think we can just show up differently as a philanthropic sector in a more meaningful way.
Thank you all for that. I think we have time for one last question. And this question is interesting. It asked, and maybe it's not only for your foundation, but what you know of the field. Are foundations beginning to endow their grantees so they don't have to apply for funding each year? Any thoughts about that?
No. That I've been fighting that fight for 15 years. I've not seen it happen yet, but it is something that we should be looking at. It is that I think that's been one of the conversations in philanthropy. I have not been able to move or seen any movement, significant movement in all the years that I've been here.
Yeah, I think that's right, William. I think the few times that I've seen it done, it doesn't seem to be a long-term solution. So figuring out other ways to do it is what we've been looking at. But, you know, it's hardly ever used. In my 20 years at RWJ, I think I could count not even maybe one finger or two that I could count on of when we've done something similar. And it's, to me, it hasn't panned out as being sufficient to support that organization's health for their longevity.
Just a couple of points on this. One, I think some of our work in program-related investing, these aren't exactly endowments, but I think we are really trying to figure out how nonprofit organizations, our partners, can develop assets, like owning buildings, their own buildings, and how we, through our PRIs and our grants, can help them in that regard. And I think that is maybe not an endowment, but it is a step in terms of having a really important resource that they can utilize over time. So that, I think, is one, and I think it's one we ought to think about more as a field. And I know, Phyllis, this is something we've talked about. Our organizations, particularly, in California, where so many of them are gentrified or priced out of their localities, we have to find ways that we can support them to stay put and to be where they need to be. So I think that's one important element. Our grant-making cycle process makes it so difficult to think about something. I don't know if it's an endowment, but really a long run room. You know, I don't know if my colleagues here make 5-year grants. I mean, we make pretty much 2-year grants. And I think, you know, how do we move our thinking towards a longer term? I know there's so many challenges with committing those resources over a long term, but that is getting a little bit ahead. It's not an endowment again, but it gives folks a run room. And then thirdly, a point I mentioned earlier, how do we as a field begin to build the infrastructure for the movement that needs to be in place so that there are some portions of this larger ecosystem that are endowed, that are there for the long run, that, you know, organizations across the country can rely on as a resource and a tool for building and unleashing their own power. I think we haven't done enough of that. So I think there's some opportunities, some, you know, shorter term and some longer term, but we may not actually call it an endowment, but I think what we're talking about is long-term sustainability in the field that we're supporting.
Marion, I think one of the strategies too, or one of the tools that is coming up is the general operating support and the use of that, which can be for a longer period of time, allows for some of that reserve in organizations that they can then invest in their programmatic efforts or invest in a different way to be able to have that reserve. So I think you're right. We may not be using the term endowment because an endowment is a different structure altogether, but I think moving more towards doing the general operating support, thinking about the duration, the length of grants, and also, as you said, how do we think about using impact investing or program related investments to provide guarantees or below market loans are ways that we can, as a philanthropic sector, be more supportive to the long-term financial health and sustainability of the organizations that we work with.
Well, we're winding down, and I'm going to give you a chance to just give one last kind of closing thought. I think we've got about 3 minutes, so you probably got 30 seconds each. I know Michelle and Marion have had a chance to give some additional pointers. Jacqueline, can we just start with you? Any last thing that you want to share or add to the current discussion before we wrap up?
Thanks, Phyllis. I just also want to thank the opportunity to just even be on this panel because it was very grounding. And I am, again, hopeful with folks like Michelle, Marion, you, and William in the positions that you are, because it's the people that change the institutions. And I'm just thankful that you all were where you're at right now. I want to just tie in my last comment to the question that was just asked, because it's something very personal to LCF. We are trying to build an endowment because as a foundation that focuses on the largest ethnic population in the state of California, we believe that there should be a community foundation dedicated to investing in those organizations that represent the demographics of the state. And because of that, when we do, all of our grant making is core support grants. And what we've also done is taken some of the lessons that we're learning right now and trying to build an endowment and sharing it with them, because we think this is about also shifting generational wealth. When we build in and invest in organizations led by people of color with the long-term tactics of them, Marion, to your point, owning their building is part of building that asset base that would allow them to have more security in continuing to do the work that they're doing for generations to come. That when communities do get gentrified, they can stay there and not have to worry of having to their rents being increased. And taking it a step further, the privilege that we have, and I say that having been in a foundation with an endowment, that you don't have to worry about your job when there's an endowed institution that is supporting you. And that's why we think it's critically important for organizations led by people of color to have that endowment so they can become those anchor institutions that we need them to be to keep building that pipeline that Marion was mentioning of those future civic leaders, political leaders that will need to defend our democracy.
So William, I know you've got something very profound to say, but can you say it in 10 seconds?
Know who you're centering in your work, and know who you're networked with, and utilize those things to the fullest of the extent that you can.
Thank you so much. So again, I want to thank our marvelous panelists for your wisdom and your insights into philanthropy and your own organizations. A special thank you to all the team members who helped plan this session and to the viewers who took the time to join us today. I want to also let you know that we are videotaping. We did tape this session, and it should be available in our archives in about 2 weeks, and will be summarized in a National Academies publication. So thank you all. Be safe, be well, and keep up the good work.
Thank you all. Thank you, Phyllis.
You're welcome.